Hello, this is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I'm Faithless Forrest.
And I'm Joe Barnhart. Welcome. We want you to know if you do or don't believe in God, you're not alone. You're welcome. The show for you and for people who want to think rationally about religion and life rooted in science and unfettered supernatural belief.
On today's show, we will dig into the documentary hypothesis, speculation about who wrote the Bible, when, and why.
But first, about our sponsors.
All right. The Atheist Society of Knoxville frequently has a fun meetup at a bar or eatery. Tonight's meetup is at Barley's in the Old City, starting around 5:30. Look for the silver-jacketed copy of The God Delusion standing upright on the table. And as Matt Delahunty at Atheist Experience says, everyone is welcome to our happy hour for food, drink, and conversation. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't.
Okay. Now, the Rationalists of East Tennessee have several regular monthly meetings. First and third Sunday mornings of the month are usually lectures with then lively discussions to go with it. The second Sunday is the Skeptics Book Club, and that's a discussion too. Oh, I don't have a...
Your microphone. All right.
You go ahead.
All right. So...
Oh, here it is. Go
there
ahead.
we go. I guess on the fourth Sundays of the month we do the Reflections meeting, and that's a potluck, often in someone's home. We sometimes get together to play board games. And just last week, maybe it was the week before, several people went up to Washington, D.C. for the National Day of Reason rally.
Okay.
And later in the show, we will give you our websites for additional details, including times and locations.
So let's go to our program now.
All right, let's go to our program. So in today's show, we want to discuss ideas about who wrote the Bible, and by that we mean the Old Testament. And we're going to talk about something referred to as the documentary hypothesis. Can we get our title slide for the documentary hypothesis? Sam, our title slide.
Okay.
So I
ahead.
first heard of the documentary hypothesis during one of the RET Sunday morning programs. Ralph Eisler, who often hosts this show, presented a program about it, and I found it very fascinating. He did his presentation largely on two books, one of which I've read. But for people who haven't read any of these books, I would urge you, if you're watching right now, you can get some interesting material to follow along just by going to Wikipedia and looking up the documentary hypothesis. There's some nice summaries right there. And so the point about the documentary hypothesis is that it is speculation that, well, some of it began in the 1700s, and I think it really picked up speed in the 1800s.
And then the 19th century, too, was very strong. Yeah.
And by the 20th century, it had become, let's call it rather mature, and of course, there's always still modern scholarship. But before we talk about the documentary hypothesis, I want to introduce three words, and we got a slide for these three words. They are myth, legend, and history. I read a book about ancient Greece, and probably on the first page they begin by talking about how the story of ancient Greece has these three elements. There's a mythical kind of foundation, a legendary period, and then a period that becomes more historical. And so by myth, I think what they mean, I think a lot of people would recognize what we mean by myth. We've got creator god Zeus, who throws lightning bolts off of Mount Zeus, and Hermes, the winged god, he's got little wings on his shoes. And, these are man-made myth. But, then we might hear about Theseus, the founder of Athens. Well, there might
have been
a Theseus, but he probably didn't slay a magical monster, the Minotaur,
So you have
in
myth and
kenosis.
legend mixed together.
So yeah, so there's this real person, and doing these heroic, mythical deeds.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a nice point they made about legend, that that legend is the blurring of the two. Yeah, I'd never thought about it that way, or didn't realize that there was a nice word to describe it. In fact, prior to reading that page of that book, I would have used the word legend almost interchangeable
Yeah,
with
I
myth.
got you,
I would have
yeah.
said, oh, the legendary, this and that.
Yeah, but it's different, yeah.
But by adding the word legend to it and realizing, oh, okay, there may have been a person they're talking about that they deeply admired. And then we get to history, and that's when people write down about, well, okay, there was a famine or there was a war.
And you can have a mixture of all three.
Of course. So when you taught in your classes, did you ever break these words down, or did you have other words that you may have used?
Well, I never taught the Hebrew Bible. I did the New Testament.
Oh, okay.
But in seminary, we of course went into the JEPD quite a bit. And in fact, we had an Old Testament teacher from England who was an incredibly interesting guy. He was a mathematician also.
Okay.
Very good mathematician, as a matter of fact. And so I learned a lot from him. And he said these are conjectures. And he said all science is conjectures that you have to test.
And for the benefit of our viewers, how would you define conjecture? When you say that, what do you mean by conjecture?
Well, you have to have a background with evidence, and then you put together a theory.
Okay.
Now, it's a myth to say that you prove a theory by evidence, because you still don't know how many pieces of evidence it takes.
Oh, okay.
So what you do is you build.
I filled in your sentence incorrectly.
You build a theory with evidence.
Yes.
And then you throw it out for consistency and try to test it. And the way you test it is you try to refute it with other evidence.
That was why I jumped in and said new evidence.
Yeah.
Because everything we accept is subject to the next new evidence. When evidence comes along that contradicts it, and if the evidence is real and valid, it's not merely a mistake, then
I was
that
doing
means
this in a simple way driving down here. I thought if I just keep going, I could make it, but this truck pulled in front of me. I had to back up a little bit.
Your conjecture had to change.
Had to revise, and that's okay, because he was in a bigger hurry than I was.
All right. Okay, so I guess with respect to myth, legend, and history, you're kind of okay with that. All right, so the documentary hypothesis begins with some major assertions. We need a next slide here.
By the way,
the Wellhausen
Wellhausen
formulation. I interrupted you.
Well, yeah, you have the same problem with the stories of George Washington. You have stories, and they develop, and you have to be revised and corrected.
George Washington is a historical people about which legendary stories are told. The legendary story that comes to my mind is, what's the one for you?
Well, the three, but I was thinking before I forget it.
All right.
There's a book called The Lincoln. I think it's Lincoln Legend, and then all kinds of stories about Lincoln.
All right.
So this is not something unfamiliar to most of it.
There's this sort of
George Washington wouldn't lie.
Well, there's and when I was real little, we were sort of told that rather uncritically, that George Washington was so truthful that he got a hatchet for his birthday and chopped down his father's favorite cherry tree. And when his father asked, "Who chopped down my favorite cherry tree?" he said, "I cannot tell a lie. It was me." And later on, we learned that no, that's an exaggeration.
I think if my memory's right, the minister invented that story.
I've heard it attributed to Washington Irving.
I could be wrong about that.
Well,
that's my memory, and we all know how memory is.
There we go.
Okay.
Washington Irving certainly liked to paint a story of the early Americas with myth and legend, and the story of, oh goodness, he slept for 20 years. I've lost his name. The title character. Washington Irving.
Rip Van Winkle.
Yeah, Rip Van Winkle. Oh man, the story of Rip Van Winkle is is set in the Catskill Mountains, which exist, and talk about the Dutch settlers, which exist, and then Rip Van Winkle's encounter with these maybe supernatural beings that were having a little match of 9 pins and drinking some strong ale, and it put him to sleep for 20 years. And so Washington Irving was doing that kind of thing. He was making legends and myths out of early Americana. But the documentary hypothesis has, according to Wikipedia, these 4 elementary features here, and I was hoping maybe I'd get you to read them.
Yeah, you got the Yahweh or the J document. Is that what you're talking about?
Yep, and then they ascribe some dates to this as well.
Yeah. Well, the J document, it's or sometimes called the Jehovah document, is about 950 BCE, they think, in the southern kingdom of Judah. And then the Elohim document is called the E document, is about 850 in the northern kingdom. And then you have Deuteronomy, the D document, and about 600 BCE in Jerusalem. And then the priests came in to do their revision. That's the priestly document, about 500 years later.
All right. So
and that's during captivity over in Babylon.
And that's the priestly document.
Yeah, that's
again.
a priestly document.
So, J document, 950 BC. E document, about 100 years later, 850 BC. D document is 600. P document, then 100 years after that. All right.
And you can see in the Hebrew Bible some small revisions. For example, in it's either 1st or Samuel. 1st or 2nd Samuel. I have to look it out. You had Yahweh tempted David to take a census of the people, and David does this, and then he's told he has sinned, and there's going to be punishment, and a lot of people die.
All right.
In Chronicles, which is a revision of the story, it is not Yahweh. It's Satan, or if you want to translate literally, the adversary.
The adversary.
Who tempts it. I mean, that you can see what the writer in Chronicles is trying to do, is to say, God,
absolve Yahweh of the problem.
And the adversary or Satan did it, and that's a big difference.
Well, it's a really big difference.
But you can see what motivated the difference.
All right, well, let's move on to the next slide on the Wellhausen formulation, the J and E one. Okay, so what they say, the Wikipedia page summarizes the J document as, the important characteristic is that it refers to the deity as Yahweh, which I guess the Germans would have used the letter J, and thus we get
pronounced like Y,
yeah. And then the E document is Elohist, or Elohim.
Elohim,
Which I guess Elohim is a plural word that might be more appropriately translated to gods.
Yeah, Eim is plural. El is an ancient Hebrew word for God.
Okay.
And Elohim is gods.
So.
And I remember in seminary we struggled with that. And one of the teachers said, "Well, that means plural of majesty," but that's probably what it became. But I think my other Old Testament teachers say no, it grew out of polytheism.
All right.
Because you had 10 tribes, you had tribalism, and in that part of the world at that time, you had each tribe with its own gods. And they often had wars among you have Yahweh as a warrior, Elohim as a warrior. And so what whenever the nations or the cults or the cultures make peace with each other, then they get a more unified field theory and have monotheism, but that took centuries to develop that.
And it would be the result of, it would follow after the political change of a more
and it went together. It has a kind of the model after the king. which is why you have God is pictured as high in heaven, high and lifted up on a throne like a king, and worshipped like a king. So the what we call politics and religion in those days went pretty much together, because you had the tribe with its politics and its bond, all with its religion. Part of the word religion could be translated as bonding.
Okay.
And so all of that went together.
All right. So the
By the way, that's how they came to kill in the name of a god, because that's patriotism, you see. But the country is bound up with the god.
So the point, though, was that Elohim is plural. And so in the version of the Bible I read, there are places where the deity refers to himself as we. And I assume that that's an echo of the usage of Elohim.
I think what happened is, and then what happened in what's called the interbiblical period, you have more and more angels developing. And like wisdom, Sophia in the Greek, the Hebrews were captured or conquered by the Greeks and had to learn Greek. And so their wisdom character, Sophia, is a co-creator with God. Right there in Proverbs, you see.
Really?
Yeah.
I'll confess I missed that.
Well,
Right.
now, and you can see how they would reason, you see. They got God named Yahweh. Now, is God with reason or not? You see? Well, the Greeks already had multiple gods.
Yeah, they were happy with assigning personalities.
And the Romans did too. So what the Hebrews apparently did is they took reason as a kind of a co-creator with God. Well, God using his own reason, and yet it looks like another God too.
All right.
And Jesus is called in the New Testament the wisdom of God. And you have in the Gospel of John, for example, NRK ho logos, in the beginning was the logos, which is
word, is
another word for wisdom, which a Jew named Philo took Sophia and turned it into logos, wisdom.
All right.
And so in the beginning was the word, in the beginning was wisdom.
All right.
And then what the Christians did, and the wisdom was with God, and the wisdom was God, you see.
Okay. So let's, I was going to try and summarize to compare and contrast the Yahweh and the Elohim here. And once again, from the Wikipedia source, they summarize the following. The Yahweh source presents a history of Israel that also illustrates themes of sin, punishment, grace, but more especially one that portrays Yahweh as a powerful deliverer and provider of his people's needs. Faith in Yahweh alone is the primary virtue. Yahweh also emphasized Israel's destiny to be a great nation who will rule over her neighbors and have a king from the tribe of Judea. Judea is the southern kingdom.
Yeah.
All right. The theology of the Yahweh extends beyond Israel and includes, notice, that all nations will be blessed through Abraham or bless themselves through Abraham. Furthermore, the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is attributed to the Yahweh. All right, now the Elohim source, they summarize, where was this? The theology of the Elohis focus on four key elements: prophetic leadership, fear of God, covenant, and theology of history. Prophetic leadership is emphasized by building the narrative on four key ancestors: Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses.
Now, all cultures have to have some background and some roots, and that's what's happening here.
Who are presented as prophets who received revelation from gods and visions in dreams. Revelations from God in visions and dreams. Elohist concept of the fear of God goes beyond reverent awe and is the root of Abraham's obedience to the command to kill his son. Covenant is emphasized by the Elohists on a number of occasions, notably the covenant ceremony of Exodus. Now, when I read that, I thought, well, do they mean the Passover thing while they were still in Egypt, or is there something else they mean by the covenant ceremony of Exodus? Do you know
Well,
what they might be
what that
referring
means,
to?
it's the ceremony is partly saying that they came out of Egypt, they were slaves,
Okay.
and escaped, and they attributed this to partly their deity, you
Yes.
see, and so they celebrate this.
And,
and then
is that by Passover, or is there
Well,
actually a separate celebration
well,
that would be called Exodus?
Well, no,
I'm
no,
missing
there's not a in Passover. That's when that comes from the angel passing over if they had blood on the.
On the doorpost,
Yeah,
so that the God would know which house held
Yeah.
the people of
But-
Israel.
but the-
Apparently, he couldn't remember.
Yeah, the real function of this Passover, however, is what all cultures have: is they have to have a way of bonding together and sharing.
Distinguishing us maybe from them.
Yeah, and well, it's a way of bonding together, and I think the whole sacrificial system was mostly so that they could share food together.
All righty. Well, then another key element is emphasis of the tent of meeting. So by tent of meeting, I assume that means the tabernacle, which
The
was
assembly, yeah.
a place of meeting prior to the building of a temple.
Yeah.
All
If you're
right.
on the move, you can't take a temple
And,
with you.
and what's more, the temple was in the southern kingdom, was it not?
Yeah,
And
it's-
so the and the Elohists were in the northern area. So they would emphasize the tent of meeting in their mythology.
yeah.
Okay, Israel's rebellion at Sinai with the worship of the golden calf, which represents the Elohist's gloomy view of Israel's propensity to violate her own covenant with God. The Elohist's theology of history focused on the nation of Israel and more inclined than the Yahwist to focus on the specific religious aspect of prayer, sacrifice, and prophetic revelation. So once again, they've got those
Distinctive.
those four founding ancestors that were that prophetic revelation was made important in the form of those specific names.
You have a kind of you could see evolutionary view. You have many versions of gods coming in. So, I mean, you got the Canaanites and the Edomites, they all got versions of gods. They're interacting with each other. Then you have a weeding out process. That's selective. I mean, that's Darwinian.
Oh yeah.
So it's social Darwinism in some respects.
It would be deity Darwinism.
Yeah.
Some deities were winning, or some aspects of deities were winning.
And the priests then got to be pretty much partly in charge of trying to ferret out what was going to be the established belief system, and along with the practices. Now, the practices and the beliefs went together. That's why they were so important.
So the final sentence is it talks about the history of Israel is explicitly religious, to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So, which is
Now, the word holy here means separated. In other words, its distinctiveness is what they're emphasizing.
and they're contrasting, and that's to contrast with how they finish the description of the Yahwist, which is to say that the Yahwist's idea about Israel and Abraham is that it includes a blessing for all nations. So the Yahwists were a little bit more like the Christians to follow, that the message was beyond merely the people of Israel, whereas the Elohists thought, oh no, we're set off, we're different.
Yeah, it's the same problem that all cultures have. They want to be distinctive with their characteristics, and then if they're bringing in others,
Then they have to somehow relax
share
that.
and make some modifications.
All right. Let's move to the next slide on the Wellhausen formulation. Maybe by the end of the show I'll say that correctly. Oops, back up one. We have the deuterometric source and the priestly source. So, how do we describe the deuterometric source? What was the summary on that? It says it's a 6th century, and its audience were contemporaries who were in the Babylonian exile, or
Yeah, And they had to, in other words, here you are a captivity, and you've got to regroup and reorganize. You got Northern Kingdom and conquered in about 722, and the Southern Kingdom about 586.
Now, conquered by different outside agents.
Assyrians for the first.
Assyrians took the north of Israel.
And the Babylonians and
The Babylonians, coming from the east, took the southern kingdom of Judah. In fact, I was actually thinking that for the Deuteronomist, that some of it was actually written before the captivity and then some after the captivity, because there was, in fact, I specifically think Deuteronomy itself and Jeremiah were said to have been written prior to the captivity. Sorry, most of it was written prior to the captivity, because it talked about how, I'm going to say it's Hezekiah, had so restored everything that it was all going well.
yeah,
Did I get the name correctly?
yeah, part of this, you have things happening, and then you have to invent some stories to explain it happened, because you don't have all enough history.
If I understood the Friedman book, it was that the author of Deuteronomy may have lived long enough to see his prophecies very badly undone by the captivity, and that they had to then...
They have to come up with a theory.
Yes.
Now, and the early theory was that you didn't obey Yahweh or Elohim, depends, and therefore you're getting punished. And you can see right away the priests and others are taking over when they use this theory. Military people would say, no, we lost because we didn't have enough military might.
Yes. All right. So let's see. Once again, from Wikipedia, there's a summary that says the purpose of Deuteronomists in the pattern of apostasy, punishment, repentance, and deliverance common in the Deuteronomistic history shows that the exiles that they were in the second stage of the pattern, and therefore the need to cry out to Yahweh for repentance. According to the pattern of Yahweh's previous dealings with Israel, the imperative for the exiles was simply to turn back to God. In other words, the priests said, it's because you've not been obedient enough to us that we're undergoing all of this.
And that makes the priestly role much more important, too. Because the priest they see is the one presumably mediating the power structure of Yahweh or Elohim to the people.
All righty, and then finally we have the priestly source, which is written later, and it says Yahweh as God who's interested in ritual. So once again, from the Wikipedia, they talk about the priestly source depicts a formal structure in terms of space, time, and social structure. The spatial center of the universe is the sanctuary, which is first modeled in the tabernacle and later in the temple, moderned after the pattern revealed to Moses. Now, when I read that, I thought, well, the description I heard, from Friedman, was that it may be that elements of the temple were sort of proportional and may have included the old tabernacle shrine.
Sure. You had the Ark of the Covenant already.
And that it was in the holiest of holies.
And that was the crucial point.
And that maybe that holiest of holies represented the same geometry as the original tabernacle tent, at least was hypothesized.
Well, it certainly had the function, and that was the important thing. In other words, you have to have the center of attention, and you have to have the focal point, because you can't have a ritual without somehow everybody focusing on it.
The Wikipedia goes on to say, it is at this specific location that Yahweh wanted to make himself present to his people. Yahweh has arranged the temporal order around the progressive layers of Sabbaths, seventh days, seventh months, 7 years, 7 times 70 years.
Yeah.
In terms of social structure, the priestly source portrays Yahweh as granting his presence to the particular people who know his name. The priesthood, the ritual system, and the laws representing the cosmic order in a priestly garment.
Uh-huh.
So,
So we have the identity. I mean, every society has to have its special identity. And here you have your gods have to be identified. That's where totems came from.
mhm.
And even high schools used to have totems.
All right.
I was in the Knoxville Trojans.
All righty.
And,
And, you know, I'm from Minnesota, and ours were Scandinavian. We were the Tartan Titans. So I guess that's actually Scottish. But, oh, hey, we're getting motion that there's a telephone call. Why
okay,
don't we take this?
that's a good idea.
Hello, caller. Please give us a name or a nickname.
Caller would be fine.
Hello, caller. Are you hearing us fine out there?
Yeah, ever since Joe put his microphone back on.
Yeah, we had a little
Thank you.
a little wardrobe malfunction there. So, caller, we're talking about the Old Testament and who wrote the Bible. Do you have a comment or question for us?
Yeah, well, just one correction.
Uh-huh.
All right.
It was Mount Olympus, not Mount Zeus.
Oh, well, my bad.
Olympus, yeah,
It was
sure.
Zeus who threw lightning bolts from Mount Olympus. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
All right.
Well,
Have I got everything else correct? Come now, there must have been more.
Anyhow, go ahead. You got another point.
Yeah, you're talking
Uh-huh.
a whole lot on these theories for the Bible and all.
Uh-huh.
But there was an underlying that I was curious about your opinion. It appears to me
Uh-huh.
as though the Jewish religion was nothing more than an offshoot of the Egyptian religion.
So, by Egyptian religion, you mean the world's oldest known monotheism is that of the worship of the Aten, which happened around 1300 BC by Amenhotep IV, who changed his name to Akhenaten.
Yes. Well, it just so happened that apparently, historically, as history can be nailed down, does it not appear as though Moses came on the scene 100 years or so after Amenhotep?
I think you could do that. Yeah, Moses gets to be the kind of a focal point for some revisions of the Egyptian approach.
At about 100 years after
Yeah,
Akhenaten.
yeah, oh yeah.
So it almost appears as though Akhenaten was the one who came up with the idea of one God, and then that God was after 70 years or so was replaced with the old pantheon of gods. But as we know, religions rarely die, so it would seem almost, if you wanted to use that word conjecture, that maybe these monotheists sort of went underground and then resurfaced again as Moses's religion.
So, caller, plenty of people speculate along those lines. What I don't know is that there's any literary evidence other than the very vague outlines we've just said now. Now, I can add a little more detail to that. Aten wasn't invented by Amenhotep IV or even his father Amenhotep III. He was a minor deity, but during the reign of Amenhotep III, he gained importance. His father had begun to treat him as kind of the patron deity of the royal house. Akhenaten furthered that by eventually declaring monotheism and closing down the temples for the other deities. That made him kind of unpopular, but he was pharaoh and he had enough control that during his lifetime that was enforced. Upon his death, a very famous pharaoh, Tutankhaten, is what his birth name was, became pharaoh. But as a child, his advisors undid the monotheistic reform, and they allowed again the worship of Amen and the other deities. And to signify this change, the Pharaoh's name was changed to Tut Ankh Amen. And I should know what Tut means. Tut is an actual word, but it's so. Although he was born with Aten as the principal deity in his name, it was changed to Amen.
Oh, all right. I'm aware of. Are you still with me?
Yeah,
Sure,
Yeah, I'm aware of what you've just mentioned.
And
But what I'm wanting to point out is the possibility that the religion was ripped off from the Egyptians, and I have this to support for that. Moses' name, Moses, is an Egyptian name. He was supposedly raised Egyptian.
Yeah.
He was supposedly circumcised by the Egyptians.
So
And so what you have happened is the Jewish religion tends to be the exact opposite of the Hebrew religion. No jewelry for the Jews, but jewelry for the Egyptians. No afterlife for the Jews, afterlife for the Egyptians. It just goes on and on and on about how the differences are the exact opposite. As if Moses said, well, I'm going to come up with a religion. I've got an idea. I'm going to make one exact opposite to the Egyptians.
I would say it's equally valid conjecture that if a people who found themselves forming a nation on the border of what amounted to the world's superpower wanted to distinguish themselves, they would make up an entirely mythical story of how one of their descendants defeated this great superpower next door. And that all of
But
those...
Do you see the similarities?
Well, in fact, there's an assertion that if the Exodus happened about 100 years after the Armanan monotheism, that places it right in the time of Ramesses or Ramosis.
Yeah.
The pharaoh Rameses
I'm
is
aware of that,
almost
too.
the same name.
Okay, let's go on some more similarities. When the Egyptians were supposed to mourn, they cut their hair. Otherwise, they would not allow their hair to be cut, which is it was the exact opposite to the Egyptians. When they were mourning, they would grow their hair. Otherwise, they tended to shave for the most part. The Jews were not allowed to wear makeup. The Egyptians were very famous for wearing makeup. It goes on and on and on.
Well,
As a matter of fact, this is not an old theory. This is not a new theory.
No, it's not a new theory.
No, Freud wrote
Moses and monotheism, yeah.
wrote an idea about how the Jewish religion appeared to be just a copy of the Egyptian religion. It seems to be very valid with lots and lots of similarities.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, the only thing from the Egyptian religion that they withheld would be the idea of the priest, the temple, and circumcision.
Well, the Egyptian idea of the shape of the universe is found in the Hebrews idea, which is a flat disk with a firmament over it. The Egyptian cosmology fits that model as well.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about circumcision. That's a very difficult problem as to where this originated.
Difficult and probably painful too.
Well, no question about it. But it's interesting to me that, as far as I can tell, it's mostly in hot climates is where circumcision seemed to develop. And it might have something to do with that. That's just one theory to work on.
Hot climates.
All righty. So, whoops, I guess we lost him.
Yeah, we lost
All
her.
right. Well, thank you for calling, again, caller. So we talked about the four principal assertions about the documentary hypothesis, that there were what amounted to four principal sources. There is something that I didn't get, that the Wikipedia page didn't list in the four bullets, and that is one more actor in this, the redactor. So the thought is that these four principal elements were written, these were documents in circulation, but they wouldn't have been bound together in one book or one scroll.
It's very likely that before you had all this documentation, you had a lot of oral traditions. And then with oral traditions, you're going to have revisions constantly.
Oop.
So we got another caller.
All righty.
Okay, caller, go ahead.
Hello. Give us a name or a nickname, please.
Central Illinois.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Sure can.
Yes, Charles.
Oh, yeah. Okay, today's topic is who wrote the Bible.
Go ahead.
Okay, most of the time we don't have any names that are listed directly onto any of the various different books within the Bible. We've got names attributed to them.
Such as?
The book of Daniel,
Ezekiel.
John, Mark, Ezekiel, and like that. But the authors themselves do not identify themselves.
Charles, let me back you up a minute. You said Daniel, then you went on and mentioned the Christian
four
Gospels. Yeah, but we began with a slide where we talked about what we meant by the Bible, and we meant Old Testament, and that's what the documentary hypothesis is about.
But you do, he's right. We do have Daniel and Ezekiel, that's for sure. And
Yeah.
But what we're trying to point out is you have it's like many streams flowing in, and a lot of oral traditions, and then a lot of people who can write, putting some of those traditions together and reworking them, and that's what redaction and editing. And during the Babylonian captivity, you had a lot of this going on. When they had in captivity, they had to emphasize their tradition, and they had to rework it to fit the circumstances.
Agreed. And that all accumulated with the 70 scholars that qualified everything into one coherent whole called the Torah.
Yeah, they had to, it's like a committee. It worked.
So when would that have occurred?
That was around 208 BC, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, you got the
After the exile and after the various infightings on who was going to be king and who wasn't going to be king, and things of that nature. The priestly class got together and says, "We got to settle everything, or we're going to have a big civil war." All
Well,
the
yeah,
time."
you had Antiochus Epiphanes coming in, crucifying a great numbers.
Yes.
And so they had to reorganize those who were left over.
All right, I was trying to take notes, and you're saying this is around 200 BC.
Yeah, Antiochus is a few years after that, but it's all during that period. What we're saying, you got the Greeks coming in, and then the Romans coming in.
And I'll confess, this part is opaque to me. I don't know this part of the history.
It's a very, very fertile period, then, not only of writing, but also selecting what they're going to call as scripture.
Now, this would have been after the Greeks had conquered the area, because I assume Alexander the Great went through there around 330 BC or so, and they would have been under Greek political leadership after that point. And is that a good assumption on my part?
Well, you have a Greek language. You had Jews now everywhere speaking Greek in their own country.
But is a remnant of Alexander's empire running that part of the world, or has Israel asserted its independence again?
Well, you don't have that much independence on the part of Israel, because you had the Roman Empire coming immediately after the Greeks.
Okay, so it came in.
I mean, you had an
When that transition have occurred?
After the death of Alexander the Great, his empire came apart. With various of his generals taking over big chunks of it.
Yeah, you have the
That
Ptolemies.
ran that area while the Ptolemies.
Say that again?
And the Ptolemy family, Cleopatra's family.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Cleopatra the seventh family.
And one of the functions of the Sadducees and the priests were to make alliances with the new powers, so that they continue their worshiping program and to keep their temples in their center. And that was the function, a major function of the Sadducees coming in later. And the Pharisees were then working more directly with the people themselves mostly with written texts, trying to tell the stories and then to work out rules and regulations and guidelines for living. In fact, Pharisees in the New Testament get a bad rap, but basically what they're trying to do is to work out ways to solve practical, everyday problems of living under these kinds of rulership.
Yeah, they had one of the major problems they had was that the division between the upper class priestly families coming back from the exile and the local groupings had had different versions of what they were and weren't supposed to do in worship and in daily life.
Now we have enough evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls to see that there was another group, a little different from the Pharisees, but doing somewhat similar things, trying to rework an orderly society to maintain their identity, and they had their own teacher of righteousness, by the way.
And what would have been the time period that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written?
Well,
that would have been previous 100 years or so.
Previous to what? I've lost
the sacking of Jerusalem by Rome.
No. Put a year on it so that I can understand the year. I don't know what.
That would have been the around 100 to 70 A.D. when the split came between them and the temple authorities, the priestly authorities at Jerusalem.
Yeah, and the Dead Sea Scrolls could have been earlier.
Okay. Charles, what I think you meant is that the destruction of Israel and the diaspora happened around 70 to 100 A.D. And you're saying the Dead Sea Scrolls are about 100 years prior to this?
Prior to that, yeah.
Okay.
At least. Yeah.
So that places it 30
that's
BC.
When we know that the Quran society was definitely there. We're not certain how long they were there, or how old their originals, or if they were copies of what, that wound up being the Dead Sea Scrolls.
And from a space point of view, it's not that far from Jerusalem. But
No, it isn't.
Of course, you had a lot of
very desolate and rugged terrain.
And a lot of wild animals, but at that part of the country then.
All right.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for helping give some insight into a later portion than I've read about to date, Charles.
Yeah. I think what we're trying to say is you had a lot of streams flowing into this culture.
Yeah.
And then
a lot of different competing factions, a lot of different traditions, and they would attempt to put it in one smooth, coherent whole.
And a lot of it is rewriting the story. In other words, it's not just all history when they're rewriting the story.
It's serving a current
need. Have a lot of creative literature in the process.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks,
you,
Charles.
Bye.
We'll say bye then. Well, Joe, I've noticed that we've let the mid-program go flying right by us. We should do the mid-program break.
Go ahead.
In case you're just tuning in, this is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. Freethought Forum is funded jointly by them and by individual contributions. While we do our break here, please call our line. It's open now. All right, you got this paragraph.
Yeah. Shows are lively every Tuesday from 5 to 6 in Knoxville Community Access Television, Channel 12 and 194, depending on your local cable. And so if you would, try ctvknox.org.
Today's show is live. It's June the 21st, 2016, and you can call in on the number on our screen, and let's get our informative video break.
Okay, good deal.
Are around the Knoxville area and are questioning your religious beliefs or simply believe in one less God than everyone else? Well, you're not alone. The Atheist Society of Knoxville is a fun and friendly group of people just like you that meets twice a week at a bar or restaurant. We meet every Tuesday night following the show at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria for happy hour. You'll find our group either inside or on the patio. Look for Richard Dawkins' silver-jacketed book, The God Delusion, standing upright on the table. On Fridays, we meet at Agave Azul or the Beard and Beer Market. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't. We all question what we believe at one point in our lives. If this is the time for you, come join us for food, drink, conversation, and fun. Do you find stories of talking snakes laughable? Do you prefer the scientific method over supernatural beliefs? Are you concerned about religious leaders and organizations imposing their values and rules on your body, your family, and the rest of our society? Well, take comfort in the fact that you're not alone. The Rationalists of East Tennessee meets weekly for fellowship and provides a forum for people who support skeptical thinking and rational discussion of these and other issues. To find out more information or to find out about our next meeting, visit us on the web at www.rationalist.org. If you live in or around the
Okay, and I think we're back. The Atheist Society of Knoxville, or ASK, meets once or twice a week. We have evening meetups for food, drink, and conversation. ASK purpose is to supply a venue for community camaraderie and outreach to atheists, agnostics, free thinkers, and other like-minded persons in East Tennessee. Our Tuesday meeting is going on right now at Barley's Taproom and Pizzeria in the Knoxville Old City. And some of us recently attended the Pride Fest this past Saturday, the parade in downtown. There's a little section here about our upcoming book. Do you want me to get it, or you gonna read it?
You go right ahead.
All right. The second Sunday of most months is the Rationalists of East Tennessee's Skeptics Book Club. The title of the next book is Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. The meeting is Sunday, July 10th, at 2 p.m. The public is invited to participate. You need not have read the book to attend, but of course it helps. Visit rationalists.org to find the list of upcoming books, and remember the location has moved to Books A Million. We've been over there over a year now, but we still think of it as the new location. All right, well, we got 7 minutes left, and we could still get a call if someone will call in.
Okay.
And we've got one more slide. All right, it's been put up. So the book that I read is Richard Friedman, I guess is his name. And he, in the appendix to his book, he listed by chapter and verse the authors to which he had attributed the various books of the Pentateuch. And the colorful graph right above my head is a color representation of that, the 4 books of the Pentateuch, where the different vertical colors represent different authors. And what you can see is, over here in the earliest part, it's highly interleaved. And as is illustrated in the examples he made, even like the story of the flood, you'll have several sentences from one source interleave with several sentences from another source. And sometimes what that does is it sounds redundant, like they're repeating it for emphasis. But then there are times when you read it and you'll say, well,
Where's the gap?
or well, worse yet, a contradiction. You know, do the animals go on 2 by 2, or is it 7 clean and 7 and 2 of the unclean? It's like the recipe got changed.
I wanted to give an example of revision in contemporary time to show
All right.
that here's a hymn.
All right.
There is a fountain, some of you have probably heard this. There is a fountain filled with blood, drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunge beneath that flood, lose all their guilty stains. Now, as you say, that's pretty gruesome.
Yeah.
Here's a revision in another version of the hymn.
All right.
There is a fountain filled with love.
Oh, my.
It doesn't flow from Emmanuel's veins, but from eternity. And all of us will catch the wave. In other words, what it amounts to is, you can see there is a fountain filled with blood. That's the old version of blood atonement, and it's gory, if not just downright immoral. And here you have a revision of a hymn.
So what would have been the date of composition of the blood-filled version versus the new one?
Well, that's Cowper. That goes way back.
Doesn't mean anything
And this
to
is
me, I'm afraid.
this is fairly new.
And this would be 20th century, perhaps?
Yeah, as far as I can tell. I don't know. My wife gave that to me.
All right.
I can remember as a kid hearing this song, and even as a kid, I realized that there is something really gory about this. And I heard preachers talk, saying that their whole view was Jesus had to spill blood before God could get around to forgiving anybody. And
I
there
assume as
are
a child you asked the question, why?
Well, I would think most kids, if they listen, pay attention to these things and have questions. And the Hebrew Bible has passages that simply don't fit with all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Right there
Yeah.
in Micah is the Lord is not interested in sacrifice, his justice, mercy,
Mm-hmm.
kindness, and walking humbly.
All right.
And humility is not humiliation, it's just seeing yourself in perspective.
All right.
And that's not bad religion.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a little different than saying
That's
that you're the
humanism.
chosen people and that you can, drive other nations out of with war from their land
Yeah.
that you're going to take
And
over.
some of the Hebrew prophets were trying to say that very thing. In fact, by the time you get to John the Baptist, you have a guy saying God can raise up seeds of Abraham from these rocks.
Mhm.
So much for that kind of nationalism.
Oh, okay. Meaning.
In other words, what he's
That,
saying, it's the faith of Abraham, not the blood flow or the sperm cells that make you
All right.
who you are. As any good Jew today knows, a good Jew doesn't say it's a sperm cell religion. It'd be ridiculous.
All right. So, the points we made represented kind of the culmination of 20th century work, but of course we're in the 21st century, and people have made, I think, some criticisms that maybe the conclusions of the documentary hypothesis are really stronger than the evidence maintains. There's just a big list of names here, none of which meant much to me. I'm wondering if you might know of any of the counter-arguments, and you got a minute to talk about what might be the weaknesses here.
Well, one of the weaknesses is, of course, you don't have any clear documents.
Mm-hmm.
These are all conjectures from what survived.
Okay.
And then they have to piece together what they think was. In other words, you have the results, but you don't have how it started.
I guess it would be interesting to ask the question, if we didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls and we make the strongest conclusions based on this method on the extant Bible, then when we take the additional information from the Dead Sea Scrolls, do our conclusions stand up, or do they need to be modified only slightly or extensively?
I think the Dead Sea Scrolls give an indication that you have these streams still flowing.
Uh-huh.
In other words, you've got a teacher of righteousness among these Qumran
All right.
believers.
Getting low on time here, so
Okay.
we're going to need to wrap it up.
Well, we better wrap it up then.
All righty. This has been Freethought Forum. Get out your pen and paper, and we'll give you a phone number and stuff. Joe?
And I'm stand by for feedback. Is that what you want?
Yeah.
And leave voicemail at 865-272-9060.
The opinions expressed on this show are of the hosts, and if we ever have any guests and callers, and they're not any official opinion of ASK or RET. We'd like to thank Sam for technical support, and the staff at CTV Knox, and of course, our callers.
Okay, and these are our opinions. We don't claim to represent any one person or group. I mean, we are given the freedom and the encouragement to try